setup in terms of doing this intro, because in these history videos I'm not really on screen for that long, so I thought I'd save myself the bother. But this is the part 2 to the wars that changed the world. You guys absolutely smashed the like target within like a couple of days. So as promised, here is the requested part 2, and we've got some, I was going to say popular wars, but that term just sounds so wrong. But some well-known, well-studied wars in this video, so we're going to be giving a little bit of an overview of all of them. If you are here and haven't seen the previous video, I will link it in the description, or you can find it in the ASMR history playlist tab on my channel. So sit back, relax, hope you find it informative and relaxing, and let's get into the history. So we begin with a bang with World War I. So the highly complex war was, up to that point in history, the farthest reaching and deadliest conflict in global history, spurred by a densely woven fabric of related events and facilitated by a forward leap in the technological capacity to make war. World War I was a war without equal at the time. So what began as a conflict between Serbia and Austria-Hungary soon exposed the complex and interdependent interests of every European nation, including the continent's greatest powers. The march toward war began as part of a revolutionary movement within both Serbian society and the nation's military. A cross-section of the population supported unification of Yugoslavia, which required Bosnian independence from Austria-Hungary's 1908 annexation. Against this backdrop, on June 28, 1914, a 19-year-old radical from a group called Young Serbia, Gavrilo Princip, with alleged backing from Serbian military intelligence, assassinated the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, during a visit to Sarajevo. This event would prompt an ultimatum from Austria-Hungary, and immediately thereafter, posturing for a military confrontation. Allies to both sides of the conflict quickly rushed to protect their various interests in the region. The Triple Entente of France, Russia and Britain supported the Serbian cause, while the already existing Triple Alliance merged the interests of the Austria-Hungarian Empire, the German Empire and Italy. The last of these, Italy, was reluctant to enter the conflict and chose neutrality. When Austria-Hungary bombarded the Serbian city of Belgrade, just miles from the Russian border, Russia entered the war on behalf of its neighbour. Germany responded by entering the conflict on behalf of neighbouring Austria, and thus declared war on Russia. France came to Russia's support when the German Empire attempted to confront France by passing through the neutral state of Belgium. The Belgians invoked an 1839 treaty with the UK, which required the latter to enter war against Germany. By the end of 1914, Japan had ended the war on Britain's behalf, and the Ottoman Empire joined the Austria-Hungary-German alliance. By the war's end, the Allied powers would add Portugal, Greece, Montenegro, the defecting Italy, and eventually the United States. Bulgaria would join the three empires comprising the Central Powers. These two distinct alliances shaped the dynamic of a conflict, which began in the Balkans, spread throughout Western Europe, and ultimately extended as far as Africa, the Asian Pacific, and the Middle East. The Germans anticipated a quick sat at stalemate on the Western Front for most of the following 3 years. On the Eastern Front, Germany enjoyed far greater success, defeating Serbia in 1915 and occupying Romania by 1917. America had remained largely neutral, though it did support the Allied effort with financing and weapons. In 1917, the Germans initiated a naval campaign with a series of attacks on neutral merchant ships, including those belonging to America. When revelations also emerged that Germany was secretly plotting to draw Mexico into a conflict with the US, America initiated the mobilization of 2 million troops. As these events played out in Eastern Europe, the Russian Empire faced widespread internal upheaval. Even as the events of the Great War, as it was then called, shifted the power structures of Europe, another kind of revolution rippled through the continent. Revolutionary Marxist groups were rapidly gaining influence and growing bolder in their tactics. In Russia, these forces were especially motivated by discontent over the sacrifices made to the war effort. When the October Revolution of 1917 unseated the Tsarist rulers of the Russian Empire and formed the Soviet Socialist Republic, one of the new nation's first acts was to withdraw from the war. Germany seized on the opportunity and advanced further into Eastern Europe, while the Allies retreated and regrouped. But in 1918, the United States redoubled its efforts, pumping 10,000 new troops into the conflict every day, and ultimately undertaking a decisive campaign called the 100 Days Offensive. As the Germans struggled to defend against their advance, the Central Powers alliance splintered. Over 2 months in the autumn of 1918, US troops forced the surrender of Bulgaria, the Ottoman Empire, and the Hungarian-Austrian Empire respectively. With no allies left beside it, and with the Marxist revolution almost also rippling through its own nation, Germany surrendered to the Allies on November 11th. So what was the lasting impact of World War I? Well, the aftermath saw nothing less than a reconfiguration of the world powers. At the start of the war, 4 empires, the Ottoman, Russian, German and Austro-Hungarian, held sway over considerable portions of the world. At the end of the war, all 4 had ceased to exist. An array of new nations formed in their wake. Moreover, the victorious Allied powers of Britain, France, Italy and the US imposed harsh terms on the defeated German nation. The 1919 Treaty of Versailles is said to have essentially crippled the German capacity for recovery. The result was an economic crisis that spiraled directly into the Great Depression, prompted a period of hyperinflation that totally devalued German currency, and ultimately foretold the rise of Hitler, European fascism, and the eventuality of World War II. The United States also emerged as a greater world power with its determinant role in Allied victory, helping to elevate its stature and influence on the world stage. Also noteworthy were the lasting technological advances of making war through more powerful weaponry and a greater capacity to impose mass casualties. With an estimated 8.5 million combat deaths, 13 million civilian deaths, and anywhere between 17 and 100 million deaths from the Spanish influenza, which the war helped to proliferate throughout the world. The cost in terms of human life was massive. Next on our list is the Russian Revolution, and I'm most certainly going to be doing a dedicated video to Russian history. But anyway, the Russian Revolution was a 5-year conflict that would transform Russian Empire into the world's first self-proclaimed socialist state, brought about by the combined forces of World War I and a sweeping Marxist sentiment among various portions of the Russian military and working classes. The Russian Revolution initiated with the 1917 February Revolution. This is really bringing back my A-level memory. Increasingly disillusioned by their role in a losing war effort, members of the Russian military began to mutiny against their leadership. Thus, when socialist revolutionaries attacked the capital of Petrograd, known today as St. Petersburg, Tsar Nicholas II recognized that he lacked sufficient military support to protect his throne. So he stepped down, bringing an end to more than 300 years of rule by the Romanov dynasty. However, a Russian provisional government propped up by the Russian parliament and largely composed of nobles and aristocrats remained in place. On the grassroots level, community assemblies known as Soviets held sway over both the military and the working class, as well as an increasingly leftist middle class. With the Tsar dispatched, the provisional government faced widespread instability in the form of protests, worker strikes and militia revolts. A diversity of socialist groups formed and battled for influence over the emerging state. Most prominent among them were the Bolsheviks, led by Marxist revolutionary Vladimir Lenin. Lenin's platform included an immediate end to involvement in the European War, widespread land grants to the peasantry, and bread distribution for urban workers. The Bolsheviks also formally militarized workers, transforming worker militias into the Red Guards. Soon identified as the Red Army, this was the ceiling for the Russian military force that would exert so much power over the peoples of the Soviet Union in the subsequent century. The Soviets and Bolsheviks shared interests and strategy, so when the Russian provisional government refused to withdraw from World War I, this served as grounds for the October Revolution, a full-scale 1917 coup. The Bolsheviks led an armed insurrection into Belgrade, deposed the provisional government, and relocated the seat of power to Moscow. Under Lenin's rule, and with support from the Soviets, the Bolsheviks established a socialist state, the first of its kind. By March of 1918, Lenin had fulfilled his first promise, signing the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Germany and immediately withdrawing from the war. The next act of consolidating power involved the establishment of a secret police and the purging of those deemed enemies of the revolutionary cause. Modelled closely after aspects of the French Revolution, this state saw widespread imprisonment and execution of political opponents to the Soviet and Bolshevik alliance, including the Tsar and his family. All-out war persisted between the Bolsheviks, or Reds, and the counter-revolutionary forces who identified as Whites. Over 4 years of conflict, the Bolsheviks emerged with decisive control of Russia, and subsequently expanded their control into the neighbouring states of Armenia, Azerbaijan, Belarus, Georgia, and Ukraine. This signalled the 1922 unification of the United Soviet Socialist Republics, or USSR, with Lenin at the helm of a single-party political system. So what was the lasting impact of the Russian Revolution? Well, Lenin died of ill health in 1924, but his influence would loom large not just over Russia, but over much of the world. The brand of Marxist communism practiced by 20th century, and would indeed set the world on a course toward the Cold War. Equally as impactful, though, was the establishment of a new and soon-to-be dominant power player on the world stage. Over the next several decades, the USSR expanded its territory, and the Red Army grew into one of the world's largest fighting forces. In fact, the Red Army would compose a dominant strand of the Allied forces in the rapidly approaching World War II. It would not be an overstatement to say that the Russian Revolution, combined with the events of World War I, would contribute to nearly every major conflict which occupied the world stage in the 20th century. Stepping off the sort of world stage now and into a more country-specific conflict, we have the Chinese Civil War. So this began in 1927. The Chinese Civil War is generally broken into two distinct periods, intersected by the cessation of hostilities over the course of World War II. The first phase of the war persisted from 1927 to 1937 and pitted the ruling Chinese Nationalist Party, also known as the Kuomintang or KMT, against the Chinese Communist Party or the CCP. The two sides actually began as part of an alliance aimed at bringing stability to China in the decades following the fall of the Qing dynasty. This alliance also enjoyed direct support from the newly formed Soviet Union, which saw in China an opportunity to extend the influence of Soviet-style communism. Soviet involvement caused increasing tension both in the alliance between KMT and the CCP, and within the KMT itself, which was divided into left and right-leaning factions. Led by Chiang Kai-shek, who himself had received military training in Moscow, the KMT grew suspicious of Russian involvement and called outwardly for the suppression of communist activities. On April 12, 1927, this suppression took the form of widespread arrests and executions of communists in Shanghai. Chiang Kai-shek purged both the CCP and leftist elements of the KMT from their seats of authority and pursued a militaristic strategy of nationalism. These events spawned a decade of insurgency among China's leftists, with the Communist Party receiving ongoing support from the Soviets. Led by Mao Zedong, revolutionary forces attempted intermittently to seize major cities, undertake rural rebellions, and effectively divided China into two separate states. While Beijing remained the technical capital of the Republic, nationalist forces extended their influence from a seat of power in Nanjing, and the CCP established its capital in Wuhan. Though the KMT was largely successful in defending its own territories, it also failed to penetrate Mao Zedong's sphere of influence, called the Soviet Chinese Republic. By contrast, Mao Zedong gained increased power as the decade wore on, marching deeper into KMT territory, defeating warlords along the way and amassing support from the Chinese peasantry throughout his journey. However, as Chiang Kai-shek's power wavered, a major external threat presented itself. The outbreak of war in Europe and the subsequent initiation of hostilities with the Japanese required the opposing forces in the Chinese Civil War to mount a fitful and uncomfortable unity against a common foe. This became a major theatre in World War II and remained as such until the war's conclusion in 1945. This immediately initiated the second stage of the Chinese Civil War, the unconditional surrender of the Japanese as negotiated by the US was largely an agreement between the Japanese and the KMT. Shortly thereafter, Chiang Kai-shek met with the intent of negotiating peace. this effort failed, and by 1946 the two sides were in full-scale conflict once more. By this time the Communist Party had increased dramatically in size and power, with its growing military and Soviet support providing Mao Zedong with the means to achieve victory, and he did so in October 1949, re-establishing Beijing as the singular capital city of China and proclaiming the founding of the People's Republic of China. Chiang Kai-shek and roughly 2 million nationalist supporters fled to the island of Taiwan, which he consequently declared the Republic of China. No treaties or peace agreements have ever been signed between these two parties. So, in addition to extending the influence of the Soviet Union, the events of the Chinese Civil War would create the largest and longest surviving communist state. The forces that assumed control of China under Mao Zedong remain essentially unchallenged in the present day. Today, China holds enormous influence over its region, the global economy and geopolitical affairs. The events of the Chinese Civil War helped deliver it to this position, even to the extent that China's Soviet-style government has long outlived that of the Soviet Union itself. Territorial disputes continue to the present day between China and Taiwan. Next we have the Spanish Civil War, which began in 1936. In some regards, the Spanish Civil War is viewed as a preliminary microcosm of World War II. This is because the internal conflicts which divided Spain mirrored many of the ideological and political elements that would soon bring the entire world into direct conflict. For a decade leading up to the start of the war, Spanish politics were beset by ideological division. Two sides vied for control, with an alliance of communists, anarchists and left-leaning Republicans forming the Popular Front, and a cross-section of conservatives and monarchists forming the nationalist movement. So, when a 1936 election delivered control to the Popular Front, a military coup ensued. The nationalist forces behind this movement represented a fledgling form of fascism and aimed to stifle what they viewed as a slide toward communist revolution. Because of these important ideological implications, the initial participants in World War II viewed the outcome of the Spanish Civil War as having strategic importance. Nazi Germany and the fascist Italian state provided support to the nationalist movement, which soon coalesced behind military general Francisco Franco. The Soviet Union and Mexico joined the conflict on behalf of the Republican forces. Though officially neutral, the United States, UK and France recognized Republican authority as well. To their perspective, the growing threat of a military dictatorship in Spain represented the creeping threat of fascism. That fear was justified as Franco rapidly captured the northern coastline of Spain in 1937, occupied the Catalonian region over the next 2 years, and ultimately came to control the space between Madrid and Barcelona. By 1939, the Republican efforts were stymied, with thousands fleeing over the border to France. The Republicans who remained faced violent political purging in the form of widespread arrests and mass executions. Franco assumed the role of a dictator, a post which he held until his death in 1975. So while the Spanish Civil War was to an extent contained within the Spanish state, it carried important philosophical implications for the broader struggle at the heart of World War II. Franco's rise to power represented an existential threat to democracy, much in the same way that Hitler and Mussolini presented this threat in Germany and Italy. While Spain lacked the capacity of its European allies to wage a war of expansion, Franco reflected the increasing increasingly totalitarian instincts of a fast-rising generation of autocrats. Moreover, whereas Hitler and Mussolini were fully vanquished at the end of World War II, Franco succeeded in keeping Spain under the grip of authoritarian rule until 1975. This made it one of the last Western European powers to eventually achieve some form of democracy. Next, we have the Second Sino-Japanese War, which started in 1937. Both before and after the Second Sino-Japanese War, China was, as we discussed, embroiled in its own internal civil war. Thus, when tensions ultimately spilled over into a Japanese invasion of mainland China, it was against a nationalist government that was dramatically weakened by its ongoing conflict with the Communist Chinese Party. Though these sides would eventually form a flimsy alliance, shaky relations within China made this alliance particularly vulnerable to Japanese aggression. The Second Sino-Japanese War began on July 7, 1937, over an incident at the Marco Polo Bridge near Peking. When Chinese nationalist soldiers opened fire on Japanese imperial troops in a dispute over a missing Japanese soldier, the Japanese launched a full-scale invasion of the Chinese mainland. The aggression reflected a decades-long effort on the part of the Japanese to grow their empire. As the Great Depression seized the global community, the Japanese population responded to economic struggles with an increasingly militant nationalism. Though European tensions wouldn't escalate into war for another 2 years, some scholars argue that Japan's efforts at expansion marked the official beginning of World War II. The Soviet Union and the US both provided direct aid to China in an effort to help stave off the expansion of the Japanese Empire. Japan's superior military forces rapidly seized control of China's major cities, but struggled to gain a foothold in the enormous rural portions of the country. Then, in December of 1941, Japan attacked the Pearl Harbor naval base in Hawaii, drawing the US directly in the Pacific theater of the war. This resulted in a global merging of the European and Pacific theaters, and ultimately made the United States a determinant player in the outcomes of both the Sino-Japanese War and World War II. To an extent, the remaining history of this war is inextricably linked to the events that played out in World War II. Thus, in 1945, following 2 American nuclear strikes on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan surrendered to the Allied forces, and all previously captured territories were returned to China. So, more than anything else, the Sino-Japanese War came to be seen as the first front in the global conflict that would touch every part of the world. Japan's effort to expand into China, and the US involvement in resisting this effort, were likely major catalysts in the Japanese decision to attack Pearl Harbor. This attack drew the US into World War II on both the European and Pacific fronts. In doing so, it likely set in motion the events that would decide the outcome of this terrible and massive global war. Thus, it can be argued that the Second Sino-Japanese War would have a significant bearing on how World War II proceeded and concluded. Moreover, America's defeat and occupation of Japan would initiate the emergence of Western capitalism and representative democracy in the Asian Pacific, as well as cast the mold for America's nation-building ambitions in the decades thereafter. In a regional context, the lasting impact of this conflict is a continued sense of resentment that prevents true progress in Japanese-Chinese relations to date. Memories still persist in China of Japan's brutality, because its essay of its female captives and the nationalist military fervor that it visited upon Chinese civilians. While more than 4 million military personnel were killed on both sides of the war, estimates hold that between 10 and 25 million non-combatant Chinese citizens were killed in this conflict. Finally, and perhaps most consequential today, the end of the conflict would bring about a return to internal hostilities in the temporarily suspended Chinese Civil War. Upon Japanese surrender, internal struggle resumed almost immediately and ultimately precipitated the emergence of the People's Republic of China under Mao Zedong. Okay, I feel like we've been building up to this one. We now, of course, have World War II. So, the events leading up to World War II, the overlapping causes of the war, its impact on the world as it played out, and the aftermath are all deeply complex and multitudinous. What a great word, multitudinous. The simplest way to capture its enormity is to recognise that World War II fractured the world into pieces, and that the effort of rebuilding this world thereafter would shape the globe as we know it today. That said, the condensed version below will by necessity leave out a great many details in attempting to capture the sweeping reality of this conflict. Several events serve as a prelude to World War II. We've spoken about the Sino-Japanese War. As Japan pursued its imperial ambitions, the various powers of Europe faced violent internal tremors. As socialist ideas rippled through the various working classes of Europe, an opposing force called fascism emerged. The authoritarian style of totalitarian rule was modelled by Italy's Prime Minister Benito Mussolini, who, upon seizing power by force in 1922, imposed a brutal police state. Mussolini proved influential as totalitarian autocrats emerged to oppose swelling socialist fervour throughout Europe. Among them, military dictator Francisco Franco would assume power and set off a 3-year civil war in Spain. And most consequentially, Austrian-born Adolf Hitler would brew a toxic mix of racialism, nationalism and fascism in Germany, giving rise to the Third Reich and the Nazi Socialist German Workers' Party. The far-right Nazi Party was a populist movement that swept up a German public embittered by its defeat in World War I and the consequent economic hardship and hyperinflation which followed. At the end of 1924, Hitler had just completed a prison sentence for a prior attempt at overthrowing the government. In 1925, he reconstituted his Nazi Party and began to hold increasingly massive and popular rallies in which he convinced Germans that Jews and Bolsheviks were to blame for the nation's economic woes. Germans proved receptive to this message, and Hitler sailed to rising popularity on the strength of the nation's passionate nationalism and anti-Semitism. This popularity peaked with the Nazi Party's major victory during the 1932 elections. Hitler was appointed Chancellor the following day, and almost immediately eliminated most German civil liberties, decreed that laws could be passed without parliamentary procedure, abolished labour unions, purged opposing political parties, and began building concentration camps for enemies of the state. Germany had become a fascist state, with Hitler as its dictator. The next several years saw the increased authority of the Nazi police state and the onset of specific laws targeting Jewish homes, businesses, organisations and houses of worship. As these restrictions grew, so did national fervour against the Jews, which escalated into an event known as Kristallnacht. November 9th and 10th, 1938, a combination of Nazi paramilitary forces and civilians engaged in violent pogroms against Jews in Austria, Germany and Sudetenland. Rioters demolished and burnt down Jewish homes, businesses and synagogues, dragging unarmed civilians into the streets and beating them. Not only did authorities stand aside as this occurred, but they subsequently arrested more than 30,000 Jews and sent them to the concentration camps, initiating what the Germans called the final solution. This was the beginning of the Holocaust, a systematic genocide inflicted upon German Jews, Gypsies, the disabled, and others who didn't match the pure German Aryan identity. Millions would perish in the concentration camps and death camps established throughout Germany. Germany sought to expand both its final solution and its brand of Nazi fascism by invading neighbouring Poland on September 1st, 1939. This is typically marked as the beginning of the European front in the war. 2 days later, the UK and France would respond to this aggression by declaring war on Germany, which at the time held the pact with Russia, promising to divide conquered territories into spheres of influence across Poland, Finland, Romania and the Baltic states. Hitler would ultimately break this pact. In fact, it is said that Russian Premier Joseph Stalin was genuinely hurt when Hitler violated this agreement and invaded Russia in 1941. This would ultimately provide the dividing line between the Axis powers of Germany, Italy and Japan, and the Allied powers in Britain, France, Russia, and following Pearl Harbor, the United States. The Axis powers would make tremendous gains in the early part of the war, coming to occupy significant portions of Eastern and Western Europe, defeating France and opening campaigns in Africa. Until the German invasion of Russia and the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, the war was fought primarily between Britain and Germany. However, the addition of these two major world powers to the Allied side of the fight would alter the dynamics of the war. Germany's attempted invasion of the Soviet Union was met with an absolutely enormous show of manpower, which ultimately found the two sides in a war of attrition. Germany's considerable scientific, technological and military resources were funneled into this losing effort, and by 1942, the influx of US forces into the Pacific began to repel the expansion of Japanese imperial ambitions. The Axis forces suffered a series of consequential defeats in the following 2 years that helped precipitate the Allied invasion of France. D-Day, as the surprise US landing on the beaches of Normandy on June 6, 1944 is commonly known, was a major turning point in the European War. Intense land fighting followed as Allied forces churned through Europe, liberating various regions from Nazi occupation. As the Russians turned back their German invaders and Nazi campaigns in Africa floundered, the Axis powers sagged under the weight of their defeat. By the spring of 1945, the Western Allies and the Soviet Union had penetrated Germany, occupying Berlin, prompting Hitler's suicide and Germany's unconditional surrender on May 8th. The US responded to a subsequent refusal of the Japanese to surrender by dropping 2 atomic bombs on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan surrendered on August 15th, bringing an end to World War II. So what was the lasting impact of this Great War? Well, the effects of World War II are massive. It was without equal the deadliest and most far-reaching conflict in human history. More than 100 million troops joined the fight from more than 30 countries. A combination of fighting, genocide, massacres, bombings, diseases and famine led to the death total being anywhere between 70 and 85 million people, the vast majority being civilians. constituted 2/3 of Europe's Jewish population. These events would verily shape the identity of the Jewish people, even strengthening the resolve to form a national homeland. Israel would declare its independence just 3 years later. Also important to note is that World War II dramatically expanded the capacity of man to wage war, introducing aerial warfare, atomic weaponry, and a host of advances in military strategy. By the time its troops returned home, America would emerge from World War II with the world's most powerful military, a fact that itself would very much shape geopolitical affairs in the coming decades. Another major consequence of the war was the establishment of the United Nations, a coalition of nations designed to facilitate diplomacy and mediate conflicts so as to avoid another war on the scale of World War II. Beyond this scope, the entire geopolitical landscape of the 20th century would be shaped in the aftermath of the war. In particular, the US and the Soviet Union emerged as the determinant forces in attaining victory. However, the uneasy alliance between these two ideologically divergent powers would immediately fracture into open competition. Western democracy squared off against Soviet communism in an effort to rebuild a broken world. The competing visions for this world and the resulting spheres of influence carved out by these forces would initiate the Cold War, which is best captured by the partition of Berlin. These divisions would also be present in Korea, where the 38th parallel was used to divide North and South Korea upon the retreat of Japanese occupiers. This would set the stage for the next conflict on this list. So we now have the Korean War, which started in 1950. So for much of the latter 19th and early 20th centuries, Korea existed under the Japanese imperial sphere of influence, first through a series of treaties, and after 1910, through formal annexation. With the end of World War II and its formal surrender in 1945, the Japanese Empire essentially ceased to be. With its occupation of Korea ended, the peninsula was, like much of the world, divided into two spheres of influence. Partitioned by the 38th parallel, North Korea emerged from the war under Soviet influence, while South Korea was occupied by US troops. The goal was not occupation, but the facilitation of eventual independence. This was attained in 1948, when an election of questionable integrity installed Syngman Rhee as president of South Korea. South Korea became the first Republic of Korea, a capitalist authoritarian state. North of the parallel, the Soviets reached an agreement that installed Kim Il-sung as supreme leader of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Soviet and US troops both departed the region between 1948 and 1949. However, from the outset, each of the peninsula's newly independent states declared itself the sole nation of Korea, and both sides disputed the permanency of the border established by US and Soviet forces. Thus, tensions persisted between the two sides. Moreover, North Korea viewed the Western powers as the greatest threat to their existence, and felt especially threatened by America's support for the Chinese nationalists in the Chinese Civil War. Thus, in addition to supporting communist revolutionaries in China, North Korea actively supported a communist insurgency in South Korea. This, combined with poorly defined national lines of demarcation, resulted in near constant bloodshed. Communist revolts in South Korea were met with brutal suppression, with tens of thousands executed even before the official start of war. These tensions ultimately prompted the North Korean People's Army, or the KPA, to cross the border into South Korea alongside the South Korean army, suffered a series of defeats. Following initial retreat, the US and UN launched a naval counter-offensive that drove communist forces back over the border. However, when UN forces undertook their own invasion of North Korea, the China's People's Volunteer Army intervened. Their support, alongside covert air support from the Soviet Union, signalled not just a new phase in the war, but a new stage in world history. Waging a war by proxy between the ideals of capitalism and communism, the US and UN locked horns with China and Soviet Union in a manner that would define the Cold War thereafter. The Korean War was now the first major theatre in a conflict of ideas that would swallow the whole world over the next 40 years. And as would typify the Cold War in many theatres, little would be solved by this tug-of-war conflict, as the major world powers pumped soldiers and resources into the support of their respective partners on the Korean peninsula. This war inevitably headed for stalemate. Indeed, the capital city of South Korea would be captured by and retaken from communist forces no fewer than 4 times. However, by 1951, US and UN forces had at least succeeded in pushing communist forces back north of the 38th parallel. This led to a war of attrition on the ground, with neither side achieving any meaningful gains, even as US airstrikes relentlessly bombarded North Korea for the final 2 years of the war. On July 27, 1953, after more than 3 million lives were lost and all of Korea's major cities obliterated, both sides signed the Korean Armistice Agreement. Though fighting ended and a demilitarized zone was established to buffer the two sides, no formal treaty has ever been signed. So the lasting impact of the Korean War. The conflict left unsettled by the Korean War remains a volatile situation to this date. With the collapse of the Soviet Union and the relative normalization of relations between China and the rest of the world, North Korea is an isolated nation. Though inspired initially by Soviet socialist principles, North Korea today is more accurately described as a totalitarian dictatorship built around the absolute power of the Kim dynasty. South Korea, by contrast, is among the world's most rapidly growing economies, a fully modernized state more reflective of the Western capitalist philosophies in other developed Asian Pacific economies, such as Japan and Singapore. South Korea enjoys normalized relations with the broader global community. North Korea's isolation, the unpredictability of its leadership and its nuclear ambitions make it a dangerous state. Because relations between North Korea and South Korea and the US are still hostile, this remains a potentially volatile situation, with broader implications to both the region and the global balance of power. In 2018, both sides met to begin the process of establishing a formal peace agreement. However, until this does occur, the two sides are technically still engaged in a frozen war. Next up we have my favourite war, or the war I'm most fascinated with. It's the Vietnam War, which I studied for my dissertation at university. I have a dedicated video on my channel, and I intend to do more videos on it. But anyway, the Vietnam War was a 20-year conflict that engulfed significant portions of Southeast Asia, particularly Vietnam, Laos and Cambodia. The three nations became essential theatres in the Cold War, and like most other conflicts at this moment in history, the stage was set for this one in the aftermath of World War II. The region once known as Indochina had been a French colony from the late 19th century up until the Japanese invaded during World War II. Throughout the course of this occupation, communist revolutionaries led by a man named Ho Chi Minh rebelled against Japanese rule with direct support from the Soviet Union, China, and the US. Thus, when the war ended and Japan surrendered, Ho Chi Minh established the Communist Democratic Republic of Vietnam, with its government seated in Hanoi. Less than a month later, France ousted the DRV and attempted to regain control over its former colony. Resistance from a group called the Viet Minh prompted the First Indochina War in 1946. The French faced fierce internal resistance, and this resistance only escalated when China and the Soviet Union formally recognised the DRV and Ho Chi Minh's government in January of 1950. Less than 2,000 miles away, the US and Soviet Union were approaching war in the Korean Peninsula. The events there convinced military leaders in the US that the Soviet Union was pursuing a policy of global expansionism by way of communist revolutions, like those in Southeast Asia. America increasingly threw its financial weight behind the French efforts at recolonizing Indochina, but remained hesitant to dispatch actual troops. This changed in 1954 when the French campaign collapsed, resulting in independence for Vietnam, Laos and Cambodia. Vietnam was partitioned at a line called the 17th Parallel, which became the line of demarcation between North and South Vietnam. During the next 2 years, thousands flowed over the border in either direction, with Catholics fleeing south for fear of communist persecution, and intended revolutionaries travelling north, with some contingent remaining behind for the purposes of an eventual insurrection. Those who remained behind would become the Viet Cong, guerrilla fighters implanted in the south but allied with northern communists. The Viet Cong would eventually become a major factor in the approaching war. In 1955, both sides held deeply rigged elections, with Ho Chi Minh winning sole authority of the state of Vietnam, and Catholic nationalist Ngo Dinh Diem establishing a rapidly anti-communist military state in the south called the Republic of Vietnam. His authoritarian rule was met with widespread insurgency from various revolutionary groups that, by 1960, had coalesced into the Viet Cong. In collaboration with Ho Chi Minh's seat of government, the revolutionaries opened up a critical supply line and fighting network that wound through neighbouring Laos and Cambodia. The US called this line the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and viewed it as proof of the central Cold War premise known as the domino theory. This held that the fall of one nation to communism would inevitably lead to a tide of communist revolutions all over the world. This theory underscores the reason that the US would soon dedicate so much effort to waging war in this particular part of the world. During these years, the number of American military personnel gradually scaled up, so that by the end of the Kennedy administration in 1963, more than 20,000 soldiers were present in the region. This escalated into the Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964, where it was claimed that a US destroyer stationed in the region had been provoked by Vietnamese vessels. This event served as rationale for the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, giving Kennedy's successor, President Lyndon Johnson, sweeping authority to mobilize American forces in Southeast Asia. More than 180,000 troops arrived by 1965, entering America into a war on two fronts, against the North Vietnamese and their Viet Cong allies. In spite of a growing force of troops in the south and relentless air campaigns in the north, the US struggled not just to make progress in the war, but to truly identify attainable goals in the conflict. In 1968, the Vietnamese launched the Tet Offensive, a campaign of surprise attacks that took a heavy toll on the US and South Vietnamese forces. Support for the war waned in the US, which grappled with its own internal strife. The civil rights movement converged with a growing anti-war movement. Protests and race riots gripped city streets throughout the US. Against this backdrop, President Johnson chose not to seek re-election in 1968. With the subsequent assassination of Democratic frontrunner Robert Kennedy, Richard Nixon emerged as president, and though he expanded airstrikes along the Ho Chi Minh Trail into Laos and Cambodia, he also increasingly pulled back US ground forces, while scaling up the South Vietnamese military capacity. By 1972, most US ground force operations had ceased. The following year, the Paris Peace Accords were signed, formally ending US involvement in the war. Still, violence continued between the two sides, most notably with the communist Khmer Rouge toppling the government in Cambodia in 1975, and North Korea capturing the South Vietnamese capital city of Saigon in 1975. I don't think that's meant to say North Korea. I'm pretty sure it's meant to say North Vietnam. Anyway, these events mark the end of the war, the reunification of Vietnam under communist authority, and a humiliating defeat for the United States. So the lasting impact of the Vietnam War, though the US was correct in its assessment of Soviet expansionist ambitions, its domino theory never came to pass. In spite of the emergence of communism in Southeast Asia, this would only come to represent one theatre in a global struggle that touched every inhabited continent. To that extent, the end of the Vietnam War simply signalled movement to new proxy theatres in the Cold War, including the Middle East, South America and Central America. The more lasting impacts would be on the psyches of both the Vietnamese people and America. For the former, the war was catastrophic, producing incalculable destruction to the cities, jungles and rural countryside of the region, claiming the lives of as many 2 million Vietnamese soldiers and civilians. While relations between North Korea and the United States have normalised, I think it's meant to be North Vietnam again, apologies. A great deal of pain remains for those who live through this conflict. In the US, the war was viewed as a humiliating defeat that cost untold billions and claimed the lives of nearly 60,000 US soldiers. It shook American confidence in the military and, colliding as it did with the Watergate scandal and Richard Nixon's 1974 resignation, led to a period of deep national disillusionment from the nation that had emerged so heroically from World War II just 30 years prior. In many years, Vietnam forever altered the relationship between the government and the public, reducing American patriotism, widening generational divides, and dying into the broader protest movement that questioned American authority, integrity, and intent. In many ways, the toxic divides that define American politics today gained their footing in the aftermath of America's greatest defeat. And now we're going to conclude this video with the 6-Day War, or the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which began in 1967. So the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is a stark example of how an extremely small region can have major implications for the entire world. Israel's declaration of independence in 1948 immediately sparked the First Arab-Israeli War, in which the neighbouring Arab states of Egypt, Syria, Transjordan and Iraq invaded to forces drove back the coalition of Arab forces and expanded their intended boundaries. More than 700,000 Palestinians were displaced by the war, and Israel's subsequent establishment of statehood. Relations did not normalise between Israel and its neighbours. In the midst of ongoing hostility, an Egyptian blockade of the Suez Canal impeded Israeli commerce. This triggered a second conflict in 1956, when Israel invaded Egypt with intent to see the Straits of Tiran reopened. Though a UN peacekeeping contingent arrived, hostilities remained. A decade later, with tensions mounting again between the two sides, the Egyptians threatened to once again close their straits to Israeli shipping. On June 5, 1967, Israel launched a preemptive strike on Egypt's airfields, surprising the Egyptians and decimating their air force. Following this, with a ground offensive in Egypt's Gaza Strip and in the Sinai Peninsula, the Israelis forced Egyptian evacuation. Israeli forces pushed the Egyptians into further retreat, ultimately capturing the entire peninsula by the end of 6 days. With ceasefire agreements reached with Egypt, Jordan and Syria between June 8th and 11th, Israel emerged with new territories in the Golan Heights, Gaza Strip and the Western Bank, which included East Jerusalem. So while the war delivered Israel to greater national standing as both a military force and a democratic ally in a region of dictatorships and monarchies, it would also set into motion the events which continue to haunt Israel in the present day. While Israel's sound defeat of its hostile neighbours would have a resounding impact in the region, the displacement of the Palestinian people would have a far more resounding impact. To date, Israeli presence in the Golan Heights, West Bank, Gaza Strip and parts of Jerusalem is a subject of great dispute. The West Bank and Gaza Strip are occupied territories largely inhabited by Palestinian people. The displacement of the Palestinians and subsequent conflict with the Israeli government has rendered them a people without a homeland, largely living as refugees within Israel's borders. The world community continues to grapple with the best way to approach a two-state solution, which allows for recognition of Israel's right to statehood and the establishment of Palestinian independence. However, these are both hard-won achievements in a relationship fraught with violence and distrust. Today, this continues to be a source of violence and conflict, with implications for the entire region, and thus the world at large. And that, my friends, is going to conclude this video. The Gulf Wars is also on this list, but I'll be honest, it's 1 o'clock in the morning and I need to go to bed, and I believe I did a video on that recently, so again, check out the ASMR history playlist on my channel. But I really hope you did enjoy this video. If you did, please give it a like and subscribe